All right. We'll start this webinar off as we let a few more people trickle in here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Whether you're calling in from a rural community, a research office, or a government office, or wherever you're coming in from, we are glad that you're here today. I'm Amanda Weinstein. I'm the Director of Research here at the Center on Rural Innovation. And today I'm going to walk you through our newest report, Uneven Ground, which looks at local public funding gaps between rural and non-rural America. And later on, we're going to talk a bit about what we can do about it. So let's get into it. So if you are new here to the Center on Rural Innovation, we believe that small towns are home to big ideas and new models of economic development can empower rural communities to grow innovative businesses from the ground up. We have an incredible programs team that works with rural communities across the country, and all of their work we do is informed by the research and data work from our research and data teams here. This report is part of a larger series. The first series we talked about private capital, where we looked at rural communities and their access to private capital. So things like banking resources and venture capital. This report that we're going to dive into is looking at local public funding. And later on, stay tuned, we'll be releasing a report on philanthropic funding. So this is the spoiler alert if you don't like spoiler alerts. La la la. This is my big one-liner from this report. What I think this report boils down to for me is that rural local governments are under-resourced. And really what we see is that structural limits on fiscal agency, not tax effort, drive the public investment gap that can hold rural communities back when they're trying to address economic growth and really recover and invest in ways that can make them more resilient. So I want to start with a cute little story about Forgatonia. So if you're not familiar with Forgatonia, you can see it there, that little red on the map. Forgatonia is rural west central Illinois. It's a region that gave itself the nickname of Forgatonia back in the late 60s, early 70s, when residents there staged a mock secession to protest being left out of federal highway and infrastructure investment and funding. And it started off as a little bit of a joke, right? But you know what they say, many a true word has been spoken in jest. And it ended up capturing kind of national attention here for the fact that they weren't receiving infrastructure funding. And it was really about investing in the place that they lived. They were losing access to rail service. And part of what happened as a result of this is that they got that rail service back and they got more investment in some highway infrastructure in their community. And so I like to think about that when you think about what they were really asking for was investment in their place, investment in their community. So I want to start off when we think about public spending is to really kind of separate this into two categories. So on the left here, we have people-based spending, and on the right, we have place-based. So when we think about people-based public spending, really this is funding that goes direct to households. And this includes a host of different type of funding. It includes Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and a lot more. Really what this people-based spending does, or does a lot of, is it stabilizes households through shocks and also retirement. On the other side, when we think about place-based spending, this is really investing in places, in communities, in those local assets. It's infrastructure investment. It's investment in their schools and community development and their local governments. And really a lot of this is about building local economic capacity. Where on the left, we're thinking about more addressing the symptoms of economic distress. On the right, we're thinking about addressing the conditions that shape economic trajectories. So when we start to look at who gets which funding, on the left, and this may be what we're used to hearing, we see that rural areas receive more per capita spending on people-based spending. And this makes sense when you look at just demographics. Demographically, rural areas on average are older. They have older populations, and they also have higher poverty rates. So structurally, we would expect rural areas to receive more per person when it comes to that people-based spending. But what we talk less about, I think, is this place-based investment. And this is where rural areas actually receive less per capita or less per person. And what that means when we're spending more to address kind of the symptoms of economic distress rather than the conditions that shape economic trajectories is that sometimes those economic trajectories can be very stagnant. So if you look here at the gap in poverty rates, we know that the poverty gap across rural and non-rural America is persistent. Rural America has poverty rates of about 13.7% on average. Non-rural is at 10.2%. So the key question we wanted to ask here is, what does place-based public investment look like in rural America? So to do that, we look at data from 1977 to 2022 to look at public funding using the Census of Governments. So this is a survey that asks government things about what they're spending, how they're spending it on, and also how they're raising that money. So first we wanted to focus on what is this place-based investment gap using this data. So to give you a sense of what is in this data, we take data from different governments in every county. So this is data from school districts, from county governments, if you have a county government, from special districts and your municipality or your township. So we're taking all of this spending and we're looking at it across counties. So when we aggregate or sum up all of this spending across these local governments, what we see is on a per person or per capita basis, non-rural counties are spending much more per person than rural communities. This means that rural communities have less locally controlled government funding that can be invested in those place-based assets that support inclusive economic growth. So when we look at this over time, we see this rural local spending is systematically lower over time. Here, what we're looking at is that per capita government spending, what that government is spending per person over time. And most recently, we see there's a $2,300 per person gap in local public spending that we have available to maintain and invest in all of these local assets. So when we break it across poverty status, so here we're looking at persistent poverty. So if you're not familiar with that classification, a county is classified as being in persistent poverty if it has poverty rates above 20% for more than 30 years. So this is why they call it persistent. And we see very different trends here for non-rural and rural America, right? So for non-rural America, those purple bars, what you see is actually higher spending per capita for the non-rural places that have the higher need, that are classified as being in persistent poverty. But the opposite is true for rural communities. You see rural communities, whether they're in persistent poverty or not, have less spending per person, but the rural communities with the most need have the lowest spending per capita. And so this brings us to the idea of what we think about as kind of fiscal agency, the ability of communities to raise funds and direct these funds for investing in their community. Here, the first thing we wanted to look at is basically tax burden, right? Is it that those tax burdens are very off between rural and non-rural places? So we're looking at an estimate or a proxy for tax burden by looking up what's the total tax revenue divided by the total income of these communities. And what we find is that it's not that rural communities are undertaxed. The tax burden is actually comparable or higher for rural communities. That tells us it's more that these rural communities are under-resourced. It's not about the tax effort, it's something structural going on here. So when you look at tax revenue, this is what local governments are able to generate. Here we see even wider divides happening. There is a gap in the ability for local governments in rural areas to raise that revenue and exercise discretion over that revenue and make the choices of how and where to invest that money in their community. And if you look at the largest source, so breaking out how we raise that local government revenue, here we focus on property taxes because property taxes are the largest source of locally generated revenue. Here we see that large gap between non-rural areas and rural areas in terms of the property taxes they can raise per person, and a growing gap. And what that means is we see this results from things like having lower property values. Lower property values mean lower property taxes that you can invest in those local resources. Rural areas, if you look at the median household income or the median household price there is 148,000, where it's 232,000 in non-rural areas, right? That means what the tax base is very different across these two areas. When we think about that smaller tax base leaves rural governments with less locally controlled funding to invest in schools, in their infrastructure, and in their local economy. And you see that in their spending, right? So the flip side of that coin, what you can raise and the money that you generate is what you can spend on. So we see a gap in local spending per person on education. This is even though education spending takes up a larger share of rural budget, 43% in rural areas versus 38% in non-rural areas. We still see that gap. There is less spending per person on education in rural areas. What that means is these constraints really shape priorities. Rural governments have had to focus or prioritize core services because of this smaller funds, this smaller pie. So here what you can see, a larger share of the rural pie is spent on education and some core services, which leaves less room for discretionary growth-oriented investment to invest in new types of modern infrastructure or new ways that they can help change their economic trajectories. And so some of you might be thinking, well, maybe it's just more affordable to be a rural government, to afford the things. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's not true. There's no rural discount for rural spending. And the example I want to give you here is broadband. Uh, Here, rural governments are often tasked with things that sometimes non-rural governments aren't tasked with when markets miss them. So what happened with broadband, like happened over a century ago with electricity, was that a lot of private markets missed small towns and missed rural areas. So back if we look before COVID in 2015, we see a very large gap in who has access to broadband, right? And this is a great story because we see the closing of that gap. But part of that closing of that gap came from rural governments who had to fill that gap in the market where markets passed them over. And filling that gap doesn't mean it can be filled at a lower cost per person. If you think about how do you serve rural communities with broadband, it can mean more line per person, which means actually a higher cost per person, not lower. So all of this makes it especially tough for rural communities to invest in those place-based assets like broadband that can help change their economic futures. But we see communities doing it. So one example we highlight in this report is from Wilson, North Carolina, who filled this gap. Greenlight Fiber is a municipal fiber broadband network that they provided fiber to that community. Really innovative things they did to meet the needs of the community and fill the gap that private businesses wouldn't. And this is nothing new to Wilson. They did it over a century ago with electricity when electricity utilities were bypassing small towns. So what this gives you is a look across the country of what local government revenue looks like. And you can see the disparities across the country. Here, darker areas are looking at your own source of local government revenue, what you're able to raise, right? And we see significant disparities on what local governments are able to raise across the country. Now, you might be thinking this is local governments, right? We're talking about those municipal governments and those county governments, but we know state and federal direct some resources to those local governments. So let's talk about that. So we look at federal and state programs directed towards local governments to see if they can help address these gaps. And in some cases, they can help address these gaps. And a lot of cases, they can help compound these gaps. So I want to give you an example, and I don't want to pick on any one federal program, but just to give you a real example here. If we look at the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, this is FEMA funding to reduce long-term disaster risk and support economic stability. If we look at who gets this federal funding, we see 83% of this funding goes to high capacity communities. We see just 3% go to low capacity, predominantly rural communities. That is a big disparity, which compounds the gap. And it means the very places who have the least access to the resources to do something like address long-term disaster risk don't have the funding. And this is not just about BRIC, this program I just talked about. This pattern holds nationally. If you look at federal funds directed towards local governments, so this is federal intergovernmental flows, so federal money going to those local government resources, we see that that widens the gap. It doesn't close the gap. We see that non-rural areas get more of that federal flow of funding to those local governments than rural areas do. And it's pretty persistent over time. States, I would argue, do a little bit better, but we still see a gap. So we still see a gap with non-rural areas. They're really too, you can see non-rural areas that are in persistent poverty getting more of that state flow, the state flow to those local areas. Um, but we see it doesn't equalize it. This is why we see the spending disparities are still there. So you do have some significant state intergovernmental transfers. These are state funds that go to those local governments. And even though rural areas disproportionately rely on those state transfers, they still end up with less spending, less revenue, even once you account for those state transfers of funds. So this is that same map, adding in the federal flows, adding in the state flows, and we can see substantial disparities still exist, even when we add in those flows to local governments. And part of this that we're going to get into a little bit more later is really about capacity. Some of it is about how our federal programs are designed and our state programs are designed. If you look at non-rural areas, 1 in 2 or more have access to a dedicated grant writer, someone who can actually go out and get those federal grants or those state grants. For rural areas, it's about 1 in 5 actually have a grant writer, someone that can every day be trying to get that funding they need to invest in their community. And this is not even touching on matching grants, right? If you need funds to match that grant, rural areas are less likely to have those funds. So I want to end here with what access can unlock when communities have access to funds to invest in their community. And one of our favorite examples is from one of our Rural Innovation Network communities is Portsmouth, Ohio. And I know I won't do this justice, but I love the case study that we have in this report. And I love that it talks about how this place-based investment started with kind of building on the assets that were already available in this community. In Portsmouth's case, they have an anchor institution. They're lucky enough to have Shawnee State University, who is pivoting toward this kind of more creative tech economy. Their game design program there ranks top 15 internationally, and they're really using funds to build on that asset they already have with getting federal, state, and private money to help build and sustain the Cricker Innovation Hub. The Cricker Innovation Hub is a co-working space and innovation hub to help support new businesses and new startups in that community. And after they got this funding, right, kind of building this leadership capacity, building this fiscal agency, they applied for and got state money to help with a riverfront revitalization, which really just gives them a space to build out a place for people to be and to invest in that community. And I think it just really highlights the importance of that place-based funding that can help shape those underlying conditions, those economic trajectories, rather than just the symptoms of that economic distress. So to move this conversation forward, I would love to have a chat with Matt Dunn, who is our executive director here at the Center on Rural Innovation, and Tony Pippa, who is a senior fellow at Brookings, to talk more about what this means for communities and what we can do. Matt, thanks for joining us. Tony, I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks.
So I want to start off really quickly. Tony, I'll let you go first. Can you give a quick introduction? And then Matt will have you give a quick introduction.
Well, Amanda, thanks for having me, and great job on the report. It's exciting to see this data, and I'm glad that we've got so many people tuning in. I'm Tony Pippa, Senior Fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution, and I lead the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative there, where we're focused on the extent to which federal policy is effectively supporting rural towns across the country.
Great. Matt?
Great. I'm Matt Dunn. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center on Rural Innovation, and spend a lot of time just making sure that Amanda and her team have the resources to do this kind of work because it's just so important for us to understand the context we're working in, whether you're a local economic development leader or you're a policymaker trying to figure out how you make a difference in rural economies. I also think Amanda encouraged me to be on this because I am a recovering state legislator, and that gives you an interesting perspective on what it is that goes on as decisions are made in state government about allocation of resources, having represented a rural district.
Love it. All right, Matt, one thing I do love is a little bit of our Center on Rural Innovation, our CORI origin story. So you grew up in rural Vermont and have talked about watching people leave because they didn't have opportunity in their hometown. So when you read this report and you hear what this report says, how does that experience shape how you hear this data and what does it make you kind of notice in it?
Well, the first thing is, Amanda, I was hoping that, in fact, my gut reaction was wrong, right? I was hoping that the data would say, Matt, it's not quite that bad, but it really is. And, we experienced in the upper valley of Vermont and New Hampshire the same kind of thing that was experienced across the country as shifts in the kinds of industries that could fuel those places changed. And rural places were overly dependent on single industries and sometimes single companies. And so my senior year in high school, we had the two largest employers in the county shut down. And dozens of dairy farms went on the auction block, and even our small ski area went bankrupt. So these are things that happen and really shake the core of a community, and you feel it when your friends' parents are being laid off. And you then try to figure out how are you going to respond to that, and it is not a simple process. And so and understanding the fundamentals of getting of how you start to get into a downward spiral, which is what it feels like because tax base goes down. So you cut services and then you have the tax base go down further because you're not being able to make the case for additional resources. And then it keeps going down and down. So figuring out how to change that trend is so important. And the report just really highlights in specificity where those gaps are. The other part is I have lots of friends who are in cities, and the misperceptions about where public dollars are going is rampant. And it's so interesting because they say, well, of course cities get more resources because there are more people there. I said, no, no, you missed the per capita part, right? There is a discrepancy on a per capita basis, even before you start getting into the issues of where is the most persistent poverty, and where actually these dollars can make the most difference. And that's the thing that's also super interesting is that you could put the same $1 million into New York City and Portsmouth, Ohio, and the transformational impact it would have on Portsmouth is huge. New York City, it's a drop in the bucket. So it's just that's how I react to this data. Which, Amanda, I wish the vibe that you have out there when you're in these rural communities was different from the reality, but it looks like it's actually worse than I would have expected.
Yeah, and I think it matches the realities that a lot of communities feel. Tony, I'm curious from your perspective, why is it important when we are analyzing public investments to rural places to distinguish between people-based and place-based funding?
So I'm going to start a little bit where Matt left off, which is like I'm in Washington, D.C., right? But I'm also in a lot of rural communities. And so, I host the Reimagine Rural podcast, shameless promotion, find it wherever you
Love
listen.
it. It's a great podcast.
where I visit rural communities experiencing change, and I would hear from those mayors, from the local folks who are working at nonprofits and rural development organizations, how starved they are for investment, how difficult it is, for example, to access the federal investment. You showed the chart, like you showed just what those disparities are. But then I'm in Washington, D.C., and seeing things like Paul Krugman's analysis in the New York Times, or even the headlines in the Wall Street Journal that the war on poverty has failed, and they're saying, look, there's a lot of money within the federal architecture and the federal system that seems to be moving from cities to rural areas, rural's disproportionately getting, large amounts of money. Well, to your point, and as you even said in the webinar, rural populations are older, they're less healthy, more disabled. And so at that level of individual assistance, where we're making investments so that people have a basically a floor of a standard of living, is really important. And rural people do disproportionately receive that kind of assistance. But for the future and to adapt to the kind of economic shocks that Matt was just talking about, and some of the rapid changes that happen in the economy or even in social structures, you need investment for the future. And rural communities simply do not have access to that investment, at least from the federal perspective, and oftentimes from the state perspective. And a lot of federal money goes to states as well. And so getting a clear picture of that kind of investment that is really an investment in your future. And that's that place-based investment that I'm talking about, right? That's the kind of investment that leads to the infrastructure that creates the environment for business development. It is the business development financing that's important to create maybe a new value chain and build on the assets that are there when they need to adapt from a single industry leaving. If you don't have that kind of investment, it's going to be very difficult to build a new future, especially when, to your point, your tax base is really constrained because of what you're actually able to access. And so disaggregating that and being very clear about how those two different kinds of pots of money, what their purposes are, you need both. Like you're going to need both for a community to be healthy and sustained and viable over the long term. And so I just thought it was, it really was quite clear when you look and you disaggregate the data that way, where it is that rural really struggles and answers a lot of questions to Matt's point, just as he was talking about the stories of where he even grew up.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good point, right? When we think, especially if you're looking at those rural places in persistent poverty, they cannot tax themselves to investing in that future
Right.
that you talked about. So Matt, you already mentioned your experience in the state legislature, and yes, that may have led to me wanting to ask you this exact question. But from your vantage point, right, what can state governments do to close this gap?
Yeah. So there are things that state governments and federal governments can do. And the first is to recognize that you need capitalization to be able to get to a better place, right? And when you don't have the tax base, because the tax base has been declining and declining, you need that surge of resources to get that capitalization so you can address then all of the other issues. In fact, we could solve and reduce the amount of individual dollars, public dollars going to people in rural places if you invested in the things that can help rebuild economies for the future. And so you got to be thinking of it in that kind of strategic way. And the other part that's super important is that rural places need to band together and create coalitions. I don't know about the states that folks on the webinar are from, but cities frequently will have a lobbyist for that one city sitting in the state house day in and day out. Rural places, not so much. They sometimes try to lean on the League of Cities and Towns or the Farm Bureau to try to get that kind of advocacy, but it's not the same. And so it's just super important that rural caucuses form, that they form across party lines, and they really dig into this notion of ensuring that those resources are fairly distributed to be able to build a balanced economy in their state. There are also examples of efforts that have been targeted that way. And in some states, the broadband pain point was so high that there was a decision made that, oh, we could actually invest a disproportionate amount in the places that have, terrible broadband, and that made a huge difference. And that happened both at the federal level as well as the state level across the country after COVID. And we're seeing the impacts of that now, which is really exciting to see. There are also things like bond banks that can be created in a state, which can be hugely valuable, right? It's taking the future revenue capacity of the entire state, creating pools of capital, and then if you emphasize or prioritize those resources going to rural places for that kind of infrastructure development, small business and innovation support, and all of that, it can actually move the needle. And the final thing I'll just mention is that at the federal level, there have been some examples of where this has happened and really worked. The Build to Scale program, for a period of time, because members of Congress said we've got to make sure that this innovation economy is not just happening in the big cities, made it a priority to have a 40% set aside for rural. And what an extraordinary difference it made in allowing for smaller innovation hubs to show up across the country. And we're now starting to see the impact of that across the board. So it can be done, but there has to be intentionality. And what I'm excited about the report is hopefully it arms all of those rural advocates to say, we can make a difference, and we need to do so quickly.
So Tony, I'm curious how you respond to that, right? So Matt touched a little bit on some federal policy there. I know you've studied federal place-based investment strategies for years. What do you see as what are the ways that where federal government can do it better, get it right to really address equitable access to federal funding?
Yeah, so I love that Matt brought up Build to Scale, and I would even look at EDA's Recompete pilot program, for example, also as a great example. Um, Flexible, large scale, consistent blocks of money that can be used for many different things, but community defined, community led, community owned. So it's an investment in and at a level that is going to give the on ramp that Matt was just talking about. That's catalytic, right? Because you can't tax yourself. You need sort of the catalyst to get you from point A to point B, so then you can start to get in both more some public and private investment. But that flexibility is key to be able to use for things that actually aren't things, that aren't widgets, but are investments in people that you can hire staff with, that you can do partnership development on, that you can do pre-development planning for. There is a big gap in the federal architecture. There's a lot of programs that are for a very specific piece of infrastructure or a very specific facility. But the connective tissue and the leadership and the institutions that need to be involved in actually developing those projects to actually spend that money is not there. It's there in very low levels within the federal architecture right now. So that flexibility, but also the size, especially when you're thinking of a persistent poverty community or a really economically distressed community, having the size and the flexibility and the time commitment that gives you that on ramp is really important. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of federal resources are financing, and so if you've got a real tight budget, you're going to be very careful to take on extra debt. And so if you have lots of needs, you're making basically a Sophie's choice, right? Like, what do I trade off on? I can get that one thing because I can take on that debt, but then I've got these other things I can't take on. I can't daisy chain debt together, or that's going to be really difficult. So actually, even having more grants, especially that are set aside for those that are the lowest, are the communities that have the lowest access to their own capital and are dealing with the most economic distress or with persistent poverty, I think would be really important. Um, and just understanding that a lot of what works, Matt just talked about rural communities sort of bonding together. A lot of what makes things work successfully in rural communities is based on partnership. It's an organization like CORI working together with the local officials and with local leaders. So we need to be funding into that infrastructure. We need that civic infrastructure of intermediaries and rural development hubs and regional organizations that bring their expertise, that bring their ability to help local communities put projects together. That is really important, and building the capacity of that particular fabric of the development infrastructure is exceptionally important.
Yeah, I mean, the work that we got to do beyond our pilot in our first year was because the EDA had a technical assistance pool, and they were realizing that so much of the resources from the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship was just going to cities. And they said, hey, would you be interested in working with communities to see if you can find a fit? And that was great because the local communities didn't have to pay for it. They didn't have to take that risk. We were learning there with them how to do that well. And it's then had follow-on benefits for a long time. The one caution, though, that I would share is be wary of the regional partnerships where the money all goes to the city and they say, oh, we're going to benefit a 60 county region with our awesomeness. And the rural counties never realize that they're being helped because those resources aren't going there. It's actually
Yeah,
those dollars have to go
have
to those rural places so they can build that capacity and that local muscle with local people so that they can get the flywheel going in the right direction again. So it's super important to articulate
yeah.
that. If you're asked to be a part of a partnership, say, sounds great, what piece is actually going to go to my rural community, my economic development entity, my community development entity, so that we can build it, Tony, to your point, in the
Yeah.
vision that we know we need and have that muscle to then be able to build on that effort. Something that I think you'll hear about with Portsmouth, where they started with, a relatively small build to scale and just kept going. And they're being able to see the impact of that momentum now, but you've got to be specific about it, and policymakers need to be really thoughtful about how they structure it so that they're not thinking they're helping rural when in fact it's actually making the disparity worse.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the other thing that policymakers and also this is even program design people within the executive branch need to keep in mind is that rural is not a small version of a city or a suburb. Like it has its own unique characteristics. We talk about capacity, and I actually hesitate to use the word capacity because it sounds as if then rural places don't have capacity. They've got a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. They might not have a lot of people like bandwidth to be filling out 400-page applications, though, with all these little pieces of data that folks feel like, well, a city's got, they've got a staff of like 50 working on those kinds of projects where a rural place does not. And so I think we have to be really sensitive and right size actually the requirements that are being asked of communities to be able to access that funding. And we just don't have enough rural sensitivity actually within the federal government for that to be the case right now. And there's ways we can do that. You can build rural advisory groups within agencies. You can test it out. You can be looking at different ways of application processes and simplifying the requirements. There's a lot of things that can be done, but we really have to get away from, rural is just sort of a smaller version of these other entities. I think we need to change the mindset around that.
Yeah,
That's
Chef.
such a good point. We see that all the time in the research. It's not just a shrunken down big city. They function differently and, so need some flexibility.
Chris
I
Parnell always says it's like saying a startup is the same as a Fortune 500 company.
No, a little
They're
different.
not. They have different needs. They have different dynamism, right? There's different
Yep.
pieces to it, and you need to address it. So thank you
That's
for
right.
letting me borrow the great quote.
Matt and Tony, I want to thank you and thank you for your insights. I think it gives me a lot of hope that we actually know a lot of ways how we can make federal funding and state funding more equitable. It's about, advocacy and legislators getting out there and doing it. So I would like to now introduce Trish Thibodeau, our Senior Manager of Federal Initiatives here at the Center on Rural Innovation, and our panelists to talk with rural communities about how they are dealing with some of these issues. Trish, looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. So today we have three leaders from our Center on Rural Innovation Network communities. We have Amanda from Portsmouth, Ohio, Bee from Aberdeen, South Dakota, and Joe from Marquette, Michigan. And they're joining us, and they are all doing amazing work on building their regional economies, deploying state and federal funds and investments that are really creating vibrant communities. And each of these communities have been awarded the highly competitive, we've referred to it before, the Economic Development Administration Build to Scale grant programs when that rural set aside that Matt talked about. And they're really demonstrating the power of public investment for their places. So one, I'd like to have you all introduce yourself and give us a quick picture of your community and what you're building with federal investment. And so we'll go Amanda, Bee, and then Joe. Amanda, do you want to start, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Trish. So I'm Amanda Hedrick, Executive Director of the Quicker Innovation Hub at Shawnee State University, where I also get to oversee our Best Ohio Industry Sector Partnership. The hub was created to answer a simple question: how do we create opportunity so talented people can build their future here instead of feeling like they have to leave? So when my generation graduated high school, many of my peers left the community because there weren't a lot of opportunities available to them. And we wanted to stop that. So our work sits at that intersection of entrepreneurship, workforce development, technology commercialization, advanced manufacturing, and community innovation. And a major catalyst for this work was the EDA Build to Scale Award. That investment allowed us to launch Shawnee XP, our game development accelerator, while also expanding entrepreneurial programming through initiatives like Ignite Portsmouth, Dare to Dream, Startup Weekend, and others. Rather than funding a single program, Build to Scale helped us create an entrepreneurial infrastructure that continues to generate new business, attract investment, and just strengthen the region's capacity for innovation. So far, we've already served more than 5,000 participants. We've helped launch over 70 new businesses. We've assisted more than 65 existing businesses with either expansion or diversifying their revenue streams. We've generated over 140 new jobs and retained an additional 90 jobs. And what I'm most excited about is how we've leveraged more than $3.3 million in private investment throughout the region. And that's just with companies and businesses and founders through the Innovation Hub. That doesn't count all of the additional investment that Amanda mentioned in the report. So we're really excited about that growth. And we know that those numbers continue to grow because the real value of place-based investment isn't simply just the businesses that it creates today, but also the entrepreneurial culture and networks that it builds for tomorrow.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Bee.
Hey everyone, I'm Bee Smith, and I'm the director of the Northern Innovation Startup Center, which is on the campus of Northern State University, a primarily undergraduate institution in Aberdeen, South Dakota. Aberdeen has a very long history of very successful entrepreneurial ventures, but we've never really honed in on the idea of tech innovation and tech startups. So it's all because Aberdeen was awarded the 2022 Build to Scale EDA grant for $1.5 million that we truly reimagined our community in a way that focuses on really getting people started with whatever business idea they may be working on. We've built our entrepreneurial ecosystem from the ground up starting in January of 2023, and we've successfully helped over 68 entrepreneurs just get started, with 30 of them actively building their businesses right now. But we've had nearly 2,000 people enter into our ecosystem as their mentors, as their investors, founders, and so many other things. So the EDA grant was truly transformational in getting us started, connecting higher education to economic development and having our rural community embrace technology and startups.
Great. Thank you, Bee. Joe.
Thanks, Trish. My name is Joe Teal, and I'm the Destination Setter at Innovate Marquette in Marquette, Michigan. We are an incubator and accelerator associated with our wonderful university there, Northern Michigan University, and we're a state-funded nonprofit. First off, I am a recovering serial entrepreneur. For all of you out there that are that as well. Throughout my whole entire career, that's what I've done. And 3 years ago, we received, with the assistance of CORI, the Build to Scale Capital Grant, which is really exciting for us because it was able enabled us to build the Michigan Outdoor Innovation Fund, which is a $9 million fund that now has made 41 investments in 20 different companies, has retained or grew about 147 jobs, and multiple millions of dollars in investments to those companies. Our organization on its own, every year, assists about 100 entrepreneurs in the tech space. And we also have received, with the assistance of CORI, a RISE grant, that allowed us to build a prototyping lab and a proto center, a proto lab, for non-technical, more individual product-based ideas. We've helped hundreds of clients in that space as well. So a huge shout out to CORI for assisting us in those really competitive grants, and excited to be here and representing Marquette.
Great. We're really happy to have all of you here. I think it's exciting to hear about some of the federal investment that has come into your community and what you're doing with that. I want to step back and thinking about the report and the importance of place-based investment for really changing the trajectory of a community. And so would love to hear from you about how are you seeing this change your community? And so some of you, this investment is a newer investment. Some have, started some of these investments longer ago. So if you could talk a little bit of how you see this changing your community more broadly. And we'll start with B this time.
Well, thanks for letting me kick it off because honestly, it has been completely transformational. Like I said, we're from the land of farmers and just what we've always done is good enough. But it's because of the EDA grant and really collaboratively working with CORI, leaning on them and their expertise to really have us reimagine what does our community, what does our region, what does our state look like in 10 years from now? And how can we build the infrastructure to do that? Again, with the federal funding, right? We talk about match, we talk about those collaborative partners, the support organizations. How can we all get together in a room and start reimagining? That was really critical to us and just getting us started with that.
Right. Joe.
Yes, these federal funds have been critical. I feel like in these conversations, I'm very blessed. We do actually have a very unique program in Michigan with the Smart Zone, where we actually take a capture of our local tax revenue base, and about $2 million per year come into our organization to directly assist entrepreneurs and clients. Pretty rare and unique. Huge support from our local community at the city level, huge support from our state. So what that allows for me to do is look at those founder-focused funds that I need to deploy to founders every day and build programming around that. That's a really founder-focused side. And then the larger scale opportunities with the federal government opportunities and other state grant opportunities really work collaboratively with all of our providers, our other EDOs in the region, on other municipal groups and private partners. We've created a really great alliance, and we're able to put us all together in one location at our innovation center in downtown Marquette, where we can all combine forces to apply for these grants, and really get everybody in line with that opportunity to be able to make it successful. Without that collaboration and without that massive local support and that really, really great state support, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing today.
Joe, I'm going to do a quick follow-up question, and then Amanda will come to you, because I know that you spoke a little bit about the state funding that you are getting in combination with your federal funding. And I'm curious about how that what does that let you do maybe a little bit differently than the federal funding that you're getting, or how it's made it easier to access federal funding? Matt talked about that importance of the state role in supporting growing these ecosystems and place-based investments. So would love to hear, in addition, that layer of the federal funding, how that's impacted your community.
Really, it's a lot to do with the matching funds. A lot are 50-50 matching funds. So having that state support to have that capital available right now when these opportunities come to us is really critical. Also for grant writing. We have a very sophisticated grant writing group that we work with, and we use those state funds to be able to help us because these are obviously very competitive. Also, for training for our staff on the compliance side, we do have the ability to use those funds to train Paulette and Mari and group and Jamie on our side to be sophisticated in the compliance side because that can be a huge resource draw. And having those resources on hand in our organization has been critical to be able to do that. And beyond that, then you having those funds as founder focus in these ecosystems, you really want to compound that founder talent to be able to deploy funds really quickly through programs in small amounts to keep the founders moving. So all of those things those state funds allow for us.
Great, thanks. Amanda, our Amanda, highlighted Portsmouth in the report and just the amazing transformation if you look over the last 10 plus years. And so I'd really like to hear your perspective of how you see the transformation of Portsmouth and the region with these different investments that are happening here in Portsmouth.
There is so much positive energy surrounding the work that we're doing collectively that it's just hard to capture. I've seen so much despair over the years, and now that's really just fading away dramatically. I could give you so many different examples of the success, but I'm going to just share two. So Allie Hall was one of our Ignite Portsmouth participants that went through one of our programs, the boot camp and pitch competition, and she founded her business and started it, and she's been very successful. And what happened as a result of that company being launched is that people that she knew were so inspired that they decided they were going to start and found their own company. And so we've just seen this ripple effect where one person who never saw themselves as a founder looks to a peer and says, okay, you did it. I can do this too. And we've seen those small businesses turn into storefronts along our downtown, and we just see this revitalization. People are taking chances on themselves in ways that they wouldn't prior to this investment coming to our community. We continue to see that time and time again. Another example is Jollyware. It is a company that was founded by a group of students that came out of a capstone project at Shawnee State University. They came into Shawnee XP, our accelerator, and developed a game called Nomad. This funding has launched their game onto an international stage where they've been able to go after funding and publishers and make change that can be transformational, not only for themselves, but for all of the gamers that come behind them and say, okay, someone's paved the way for me. A small kid from a small town can do the same thing and have a global export. Those are the things that we're seeing from place-based investment. Otherwise, they would have continued to receive those people-based investments, the SNAP benefits and the social services. But because we're giving them the tools and we're giving them the pathways to see success differently through this investment, we're going to eliminate the need for those other resources and services. It's exciting.
Yeah, I love how you bring it back, the place-based investment. It really is about the people in your community. And you're changing, all of you're changing the narrative of what's possible in your community. You're building upon your history and the tenacity of the folks that live within your community. And so the importance of how that really changes the community's trajectory, but individuals too. So Matt and Tony talked, we just have a few minutes left, about the challenges for rural communities. You've been very successful. And in this process, I imagine that you've learned a lot. Talk a little bit, two questions of, what did it take for you to be able to, let's say, build to scale, win this build to scale competition? And then, what would you say to rural communities that are thinking about applying for federal funds? Maybe it's not a build to scale, but they're applying and they haven't done so yet. So what helped you get it, and what advice would you give to rural communities?
So I'll take this one only because I see the chat blowing up. Things like rural communities may be hesitant about applying for federal funds because they're being pulled back. I love Marty's question about how do we get started. So the best advice I can give you is just do it. Get a group of people together that all see and have faith in the next thing for your community. I mean, our conversation is now transformed into a group that we call the next big thing. What is that in Aberdeen? But then when it comes to funds and just the volatility of that, you're building that supportive ecosystem to help support you through those times. Again, it looks different in every rural community. And one thing that I do hope to see with federal funding is the idea of in kind, because in kind just allows those collaborative organizations skin in the game, truly letting rural communities leverage those already established infrastructural things, organizational development that we can then use in a different way, allowing us more time to build these ecosystems. Place-based economic development, it's a long game. It's not a short game. You heard from Amanda and Joe, the jobs that they've created. We're not there yet. We can't quantify that quite yet, but give us a little bit more time and we'll be able to.
I have a inspiration, if you will. This last year, OffSnap, one of our companies, was the CORI Rural Innovation Award winner, right? And Gretchen got to go on the stage at CORI and present and win that award. SynCurrent was a top 10 GovTech company this last year and was listed, internationally for government technologies. Swim Smart Tech installed the largest beachfront in Michigan on Lake Michigan and saved 7 lives last year. Young people who were on that beach, who these first responders wanted. The founders, you have to be very passionate about this. It takes a lot of time. You have to go where the founders are. Most of my meetings are in the evening. Most of my meetings are, not during regular working hours with single moms in our community, other stuff like that. It's the passion to see those founders' success. And when you start to see that founder success, it just starts to build and build and build and build in your community. And our community is now excited about it. When I first got to Marquette, they said, "What's innovation? What's this gonna look like?" And I said, "I have no idea." But just through consistent effort and the success of those entrepreneurs and seeing those founders and their successes will propel your community forward. And that's what this is all about. And it's amazing if you stick with it.
Right. Amanda, any final thoughts?
Yes. So don't underestimate what your community has to offer. I think that is my biggest takeaway here. And don't assume that someone else is going to tell your story. Rural communities have unique strengths, and those strengths deserve national investment. We are worth investing in. The people, the places, we are worth it.
Right. Well, thank you all. I know that we could go on much, much longer and talk about all aspects of this, and I wish we had the time, but unfortunately, we are reaching the end of the webinar time. I want to thank you all for sharing your experience, your knowledge, your passion, and look forward to continuing to watch your communities evolve and grow. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. This was such a great conversation. I am so excited that you're able to join us. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on LinkedIn, follow our newsletter. We have more to come, and stay tuned. Thank you and have a good weekend.